Good morning, sisters, and welcome to our Promises and Attributes episode 7. I am super excited to talk to you about this one today because this is possibly my very favorite promise in all of Scripture. I want to start us out in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6. And God tells the children of Israel here, For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love upon you nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the fewest of all people, but because the Lord loved you. I love this idea of God choosing people to serve him who are weak and simple. He has used those very words in talking about the people who will do works in his kingdom and share his gospel around the world, that he calls the weak and the simple to do those things. So he has chosen the children of Israel, and he has chosen us, not because we have any special abilities or special power, not because we're better than anyone else, but because he loves us. And because he loves us, he knows us. And he knows that our abilities and talents are ripe for sharing the gospel and being able to complete this mission here on earth. So he asks the weak, and because we are weak, we can maybe feel inadequate. And the scriptures show tons of examples of this. And I just want to share a few with you, just so you know what good company you're in and what miracles God can do with weak people. Moses said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" When God asked Gideon, who is not a super well-known character, but is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, he asks Gideon to lead an army to conquer the Midianites. And Gideon says, "Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? I am the least in my father's house." We see it with Saul when he is told that he is to become the next king. His response is, "Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speakest thou so to me?" We see this with Enoch too. Enoch says, "Why is it that I have found favor in thy sight? I am but a lad, and all of the people hate me, for I am slow of speech. Wherefore am I thy servant?" All of these people recognize their great weakness. And the beautiful thing is, being weak and being small and being unimportant does not change the fact that you can be chosen of God. Look at Nephi. He was chosen by God to get the brass plates and to help lead his family out of Jerusalem and to build a ship to lead his family to the promised land, all when he was the youngest of his father's sons. He had no power. He had no birthright. He was maybe considered a nobody a little bit in that society, and yet God had it work for him. And it didn't matter how weak he was. Think about Joseph Smith, the work that God had for him to do, even though he was poor, uneducated farmer who, through the power of God, was able to restore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the earth and all the things that came along with that. Look at David, who was just a young boy, but was able to slay a giant, even though he couldn't even wear any armor because it was too big for him. He didn't need to be anything special because God made him special. And that's the beautiful promise here. God asks the weak and the simple to help him because he has the power to make weak things strong. I love what Paul says, because Paul has a similar moment of recognizing that he isn't adequate for the task that he's been given either. He says, "I am the least of the apostles, for I am not meet to be called apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But," this is the best part, "by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace, which was bestowed upon me, was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of God, which was with me." Paul recognized that even though he was weak, even though he was a sinner, It was the grace of God and God's enabling power that helped him to do the amazing things that he was then able to do. And we all know he did amazing things. So this idea of being chosen, it doesn't matter how weak you feel or how weak you are. God has the potential to do amazing things with you, but you also have to choose him. And I want to read you, there's a story in John 6, that I think can be a really apt parable to what it means to choose God. This is the story of when Jesus is he feeds the 5,000. And he's been teaching, and there's this multitude that is gathered. And so he says to his disciples, as a way to kind of test them and see what they would do, he's like, well, where are we going to find bread to feed all of these people? And they kind of look at each other, and they look at him, they're like, 200 penny worth of bread, which is 8 months' salary back then, isn't enough to feed these people so that they each get even a little. And he's like, okay. So then Andrew says, well, there's this boy over here, and he has 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. And then he says this, but what are they among so many? Do you ever feel like that? That you have what you have to offer, you know, like Gideon and Saul and Moses is just like, well, I have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That you have this very small offering. But what is that among so many? What is that among all of this need? Here is where the miracle happens. Here is the epitome of this promise. The boy gives everything he has to God, to Jesus. He turns that over to him, and we all know what happens, right? Jesus blesses the food. He passes it to the disciples pass it to people, and it says that they were able to eat as much as they would and were filled. 5,000 people were able to eat as much as they would and were filled. Then, this is almost the best part. He asked them to gather up the what remained, and it was 12 baskets worth of food. 12 baskets. This is possible for us too. This is the promise that Jesus gives to us. That if we give the little tiny, meager, weak, simple things and offerings that we have, if we give him our whole soul as an offering, if we have a willing heart and a willing mind, then he can magnify whatever weakness there is in us to make it enough, but not just enough. He makes it enough and then to spare. There are 12 baskets full of remnants, 12 baskets full of blessings for us in this process. I love what he says to Moses back in Exodus 3. And he says, when ye go, ye shall not go empty. That's the promise that God gives us. We give him everything, but in so doing, we don't go away empty. We go away with abundance, with 12 baskets full. There's a beautiful quote, and I can't remember if it's by Marion G. Romney or Marvin J. Ashton, but it says, you cannot give a crust of bread to the Lord without receiving a loaf in return. That is what I think Nelia Maxwell would call the economy of heaven, right? It doesn't make sense, but that's how it works. That all of these weak and simple people were able to be strong and to be the instrument to do amazing things because they turned everything over to Jesus Christ. And the same is possible for us. I just want to end with one of my very favorite scriptures. This is Paul again. And we know that Paul has an amazing understanding of grace. But he says this, that when he was in despair because of the thorn of his flesh, this is what Christ says to him. And what he says really to all of us. He says, he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Paul recognized that when he was weak, that was opportunity for Christ to enter into his life and into his story and make him strong enough to work miracles for him, that in his weakness, Christ could fill in the gaps and make him strong enough and up to the tasks that were ahead of him. And he will do the same for each one of us, sisters. And that is a beautiful, beautiful promise, and what the atonement of Jesus Christ is truly all about.